The Man in the Brown Suit by Agatha Christie. Chapter 4. Nobody came forward to identify the dead woman. The inquest elicited the following facts. Shortly after 1 o'clock on 8th January, a well-dressed woman with a slight foreign accent had entered the offices of Messrs. Butler and Park, house agents, in Knightsbridge. She explained that she wanted to rent or purchase a house on the Thames within easy reach of London. The particulars of several were given to her, including those of the Mill House. She gave the name of Mrs. de Castina and her address as the Ritz, but there proved to be no one of that name staying there, and the hotel people failed to identify the body. Mrs. James, the wife of Sir Eustace Pedlar's gardener, who acted as caretaker to the Mill House and inhabited the small lodge opening on the main road, gave evidence. About 3 o'clock that afternoon, a lady came to see over the house. She produced an order from the house agents, and, as was the usual custom, Mrs. James gave her the keys of the house. It was situated at some distance from the lodge, and she was not in the habit of accompanying prospective tenants. A few minutes later, a young man arrived. Mrs. James described him as tall and broad-shouldered, with a bronzed face and light grey eyes. He was clean-shaven and was wearing a brown suit. He explained to Mrs. James that he was a friend of the lady who had come to look over the house, but had stopped at the post office to send a telegram. She directed him to the house, and thought no more about the matter. 5 minutes later he reappeared, handed her back the keys and explained that he feared the house would not suit them. Mrs. James did not see the lady, but thought that she had gone on ahead. What she did notice was that the young man seemed very much upset about something. He looked like a man who would seen a ghost. I thought he was taken ill. On the following day, another lady and gentleman came to see the property and discovered the body lying on the floor in one of the upstairs rooms. Mrs. James identified it as that of the lady who had come the day before. The house agents also recognized it as that of Mrs. de Castina. The police surgeon gave it as his opinion that the woman had been dead about 24 hours. The Daily Budget had jumped to the conclusion that the man in the tube had murdered the woman and afterwards committed suicide. However, as the tube victim was dead at 2 o'clock, and the woman was alive and well at 3 o'clock, the only logical conclusion to come to was that the two occurrences had nothing to do with each other, and that the order to view the house at Marlow found in the dead man's pocket was merely one of those coincidences which so often occur in this life. A verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown was returned, and the police and the Daily Budget were left to look for the man in the brown suit. Since Mrs. James was positive that there was no one in the house when the lady entered it, and that nobody except the young man in question entered it until the following afternoon, it seemed only logical to conclude that he was the murderer of the unfortunate Mrs. de Castina. She had been strangled with a piece of stout black cord, and had evidently been caught unawares with no time to cry out. The black silk handbag which she carried contained a well-filled note-case and some loose change, a fine lace handkerchief, unmarked, and the return half of a first-class ticket to London. Nothing much there to go upon. Such were the details published broadcast by the Daily Budget, and "Find the Man in the Brown Suit" was their daily war cry. On an average, about 500 people wrote daily to announce their success in the quest, and tall young men with Welton faces cursed the day when their tailors had persuaded them to a brown suit. The accident in the tube, dismissed as a coincidence, faded out of the public mind. Was it a coincidence? I was not so sure. No doubt I was prejudiced. The tube incident was my own pet mystery, but there certainly seemed to me to be a connection of some kind between the two fatalities. In each there was a man with a tanned face, evidently an Englishman living abroad, and there were other things. it was the consideration of these other things that finally impelled me to what I considered a dashing step. I presented myself at Scotland Yard and demanded to see whoever was in charge of the Mill House case. My request took some time to understand, as I had inadvertently selected the department for lost umbrellas, but eventually I was ushered into a small room and presented to Detective Inspector Meadows. Inspector Meadows was a small man with a ginger head and what I considered a peculiarly irritating manner. A satellite, also in plain clothes, sat unoppressively in a corner. "Good morning," I said nervously. "Good morning. Will you take a seat? I understand you've something to tell me that you think may be of use to us." His tone seemed to indicate that such a thing was unlikely in the extreme. I felt my temper stirred. "Of course you know about the man who was killed in the tube? The man who had an order to view this same house at Marlow in his pocket." "Ah," said the inspector. "You are the Miss Bedingfeld who gave evidence at the inquest." Certainly the man had an order in his pocket. A lot of other people may have had too, only they didn't happen to be killed. I rallied my forces. "You don't think it odd that this man had no ticket in his pocket? Easiest thing in the world to drop your ticket. Done it myself. And no money. He had some loose change in his trousers pocket. But no note case. Some men don't carry a pocketbook or note case of any kind." I tried another tack. "You don't think it's odd that the doctor never came forward afterwards? A busy medical man very often doesn't read the papers. He probably forgot all about the accident." "In fact, Inspector, you are determined to find nothing odd," I said sweetly. "Well, I'm inclined to think you're a little too fond of the word, Miss Bedingfeld. Young ladies are romantic, I know, fond of mysteries and such like. But as I'm a busy man—" I took the hint and rose. The man in the corner raised a meek voice. "Perhaps the young lady would tell us briefly what her ideas really are on the subject, Inspector?" The inspector fell in with the suggestion readily enough. "Yes, come now, Miss Bedingfeld, don't be offended. You've asked questions and hinted things. Just say straight out what it is you've got in your head." I wavered between injured dignity and the overwhelming desire to express my theories. Injured dignity went to the wall. "You said at the inquest you were positive it wasn't suicide?" "Yes, I'm quite certain of that." The man was frightened. What frightened him? It wasn't me. But someone might have been walking up the platform towards us, someone he recognized. "You didn't see anyone?" "No," I admitted. "I didn't turn my head." Then, as soon as the body was recovered from the line, a man pushed forward to examine it, saying he was a doctor. "Nothing unusual in that," said the inspector dryly. "But he wasn't a doctor." "What?" "He wasn't a doctor," I repeated. "How do you know that, Miss Bedingfeld?" "It's difficult to say, exactly. I've worked in hospital during the war, and I've seen doctors handle bodies. There's a sort of deft professional callousness that this man hadn't got. Besides, a doctor doesn't usually feel for the heart on the right side of the body. He did that." "Yes, I didn't notice it specially at the time, except that I felt there was something wrong. But I worked it out when I got home, and then I saw why the whole thing had looked so unhandy to me at the time." "HM," said the inspector. He was reaching slowly for pen and paper. In running his hands over the upper part of the man's body, he would have ample opportunity to take anything he wanted from the pockets. "Doesn't sound likely to me," said the inspector. "But, well, can you describe him at all?" He was tall and broad-shouldered, wore a dark overcoat and black boots, a bowler hat. He had a dark pointed beard and gold-rimmed eyeglasses. Take away the overcoat, the beard, and the eyeglasses, and there wouldn't be much to know him by, grumbled the inspector. He could alter his appearance easy enough in 5 minutes if he wanted to, which he would do if he's the swell pickpocket you suggest. I had not intended to suggest anything of the kind. But from this moment I gave the inspector up as hopeless. Nothing more you can tell us about him? He demanded as I rose to depart. Yes, I said. I seized my opportunity to fire a parting shot. His head was markedly brachycephalic. He will not find it so easy to alter that. I observed with pleasure that Inspector Meadows' pen wavered. It was clear that he did not know how to spell brachycephalic. Chapter 5. In the first heat of indignation, I found my next step unexpectedly easy to tackle. I had a half-formed plan in my head when I went into Scotland Yard. One to be carried out if my interview there was unsatisfactory. It had been profoundly unsatisfactory. That is, if I had the nerve to go through with it. Things that one would shrink from attempting normally are easily tackled in a flush of anger. Without giving myself time to reflect, I walked straight to the house of Lord Naseby. Lord Naseby was the millionaire owner of the Daily Budget. He owned other papers, several of them, but the Daily Budget was his special child. It was as the owner of the Daily Budget that he was known to every householder in the United Kingdom. Owing to the fact that an itinerary of the great man's daily proceedings had just been published, I knew exactly where to find him at this moment. It was his hour for dictating to his secretary in his own house. I did not, of course, suppose that any young woman who chose to come and ask for him would be at once admitted to the august presence. But I had attended to that side of the matter. In the card tray in the hall of the Fleming's house, I had observed the card of the Marquis of Loamsley, England's most famous sporting peer. I had removed the card, cleaned it carefully with breadcrumbs, and penciled upon it the words, "Please give Miss Bedingfeld a few moments of your time." Adventuresses must not be too scrupulous in their methods. The thing worked. A powdered footman received the card and bore it away. Presently a pale secretary appeared. I fenced with him successfully. He retired defeated. He again reappeared and begged me to follow him. I did so. I entered a large room. A frightened-looking shorthand typist fled past me like a visitant from the spirit world. Then the door shut and I was face to face with Lord Naseby. A big man. Big head. Big face. Big mustache. Big stomach. I pulled myself together. I had not come here to comment on Lord Nasby's stomach. He was already roaring at me. Well, what is it? What does Loamsley want? You his secretary? What's it all about? To begin with, I said with as great an appearance of coolness as I could manage, I don't know Lord Loamsley, and he certainly knows nothing about me. I took his card from the tray in the house of the people I'm staying with, and I wrote those words on it myself. It was important that I should see you. For a moment it appeared to be a toss-up as to whether Lord Naseby had apoplexy or not. In the end, he swallowed twice and got over it. I admire your coolness, young woman. Well, you see me. If you interest me, you will continue to see me for exactly 2 minutes longer. That will be ample, I replied. And I shall interest you. It's the Mill House mystery. If you found the man in the brown suit, write to the editor, he interrupted hastily. If you will interrupt, I shall be more than 2 minutes, I said sternly. I haven't found the man in the brown suit, but I'm quite likely to do so. In as few words as possible, I put the facts of the tube accident and the conclusions I had drawn from them before him. When I had finished, he said unexpectedly, "What do you know of brachycephalic heads?" I mentioned Papa. "The monkey man? Eh? Well, you seem to have a head of some kind upon your own shoulders, young woman. But it's all pretty thin, you know. Not much to go upon. And no use to us, as it stands. I'm perfectly aware of that. What do you want, then?" "I want a job on your paper to investigate this matter." "Can't do that. We've got our own special man on it. And I've got my own special knowledge." "What you've just told me, eh?" "Oh, no, Lord Nasby. I've still got something up my sleeve." "Oh, you have you? You seem a bright sort of girl. Well, what is it?" When this so-called doctor got into the lift, he dropped a piece of paper. I picked it up. It smelt of mothballs. So did the dead man. The doctor didn't. So I saw at once that the doctor must have taken it off the body. It had two words written on it and some figures. "Let's see it." Lord Nasby stretched out a careless hand. "I think not," I said, smiling. "It's my find, you see." "I'm right. You are a bright girl. Quite right to hang on to it. No scruples about not handing it over to the police. I went there to do so this morning. They persisted in regarding the whole thing as having nothing to do with the Marlowe affair, so I thought that in the circumstances I was justified in retaining the paper. Besides, the inspector put my back up. Short-sighted man. Well, my dear girl, here's all I can do for you. Go on working on this line of yours. If you get anything that's publishable, send it along and you shall have your chance. There's always room for real talent on the daily budget. But you've got to make good first. See?" I thanked him and apologized for my methods. "Don't mention it. I rather like cheek from a pretty girl. By the way, you said 2 minutes and you've been 3, allowing for interruptions. For a woman, that's quite remarkable. Must be your scientific training." I was in the street again, breathing hard as though I had been running. I found Lord Nasby rather wearing as a new acquaintance. Chapter 6. I went home with a feeling of exultation. My scheme had succeeded far better than I could possibly have hoped. Lord Nasby had been positively genial. It only now remained for me to make good, as he expressed it. Once locked in my own room, I took out my precious piece of paper and studied it attentively. Here was the clue to the mystery. To begin with, what did the figures represent? There were 5 of them, and a dot after the first 2. 17, 122, I murmured. That did not seem to lead to anything. Next I added them up. That is often done in works of fiction and leads to surprising deductions. 1 and 7 make 8 and 1 is 9 and 2 are 11 and 2 are 13. 13. Fateful number. Was this a warning to me to leave the whole thing alone? Very possibly. Anyway, except as a warning, it seemed to be singularly useless. I declined to believe that any conspirator would take that way of writing 13 in real life. If he meant 13, he would write 13. 13, like that. There was a space between the 1 and the 2. I accordingly subtracted 22 from 171. The result was 159. I did it again and made it 149. These arithmetical exercises were doubtless excellent practice, but as regarded the solution of the mystery, they seemed totally ineffectual. I left arithmetic alone, not attempting fancy division or multiplication, and went on to the words. Kilmorden Castle. That was something definite. A place. Probably the cradle of an aristocratic family. Missing heir? Claimant to title? Or possibly a picturesque ruin. Buried treasure? Yes, on the whole, I incline to the theory of buried treasure. Figures always go with buried treasure. 1 pace to the right, 7 paces to the left, dig 1 foot, descend 22 steps. That sort of idea. I could work out that later. The thing was to get to Kilmorden Castle as quickly as possible. I made a strategic sally from my room and returned laden with books of reference. Who's Who, Whitaker, a gazetteer, a history of Scotch ancestral homes, and Somebody or Other's British Isles. Time passed. I searched diligently, but with growing annoyance. Finally, I shut the last book with a bang. There appeared to be no such place as Kilmorden Castle. Here was an unexpected check. There must be such a place. Why should anyone invent a name like that and write it down on a piece of paper? Absurd. Another idea occurred to me. Possibly it was a castellated abomination in the suburbs with a high-sounding name invented by its owner. But if so, it was going to be extraordinarily hard to find. I sat back gloomily on my heels. I always sit on the floor to do anything really important, and wondered how on earth I was to set about it. Was there any other line I could follow? I reflected earnestly and then sprang to my feet delightedly. Of course. I must visit the scene of the crime. Always done by the best sleuths. And no matter how long afterwards it may be, they always find something that the police have overlooked. My course was clear. I must go to Marlow. But how was I to get into the house? I discarded several adventurous methods and plumped for stern simplicity. The house had been to let, presumably was still to let. I would be a prospective tenant. I also decided on attacking the local house agents as having fewer houses on their books. Here, however, I reckoned without my host. A pleasant clerk produced particulars of about half a dozen desirable properties. It took all my ingenuity to find objections to them. In the end, I feared I had drawn a blank. And you've really nothing else? I asked, gazing pathetically into the clerk's eyes. Something right on the river, and with a fair amount of garden and a small lodge, I added, summing up the main points of the mill house as I had gathered them from the papers. Well, of course there's Sir Eustace Pedlar's place, said the man doubtfully. The mill house, you know. Not where, I faltered. Really, faltering is getting to be my strong point. That's it. Where the murder took place. But perhaps you wouldn't like. Oh, I don't think I should mind, I said with an appearance of rallying. I felt my bona fides was now quite established. And perhaps I might get it cheap in the circumstances. A master touch that, I thought. Well, it's possible. There's no pretending that it will be easy to let now, servants and all that, you know. If you like the place after you've seen it, I should advise you to make an offer. Shall I write you out an order? If you please. A quarter of an hour later, I was at the lodge of the mill house. In answer to my knock, the door flew open and a tall middle-aged woman literally bounced out. Nobody can go into the house, do you hear that? Fairly sick of you reporters, I am. Sir Eustace's orders are. I understood the house was to let, I said freezingly, holding out my order. Of course, if it's already taken. Oh, I'm sure I beg your pardon, miss. I've been fairly pestered with these newspaper people. Not a minute's peace. No, the house isn't let, nor likely to be now. Are the drains wrong? I asked in an anxious whisper. Oh, Lord, miss, the drains is all right. But surely you've heard about that foreign lady as was done to death here. I believe I did read something about it in the papers, I said carelessly. My indifference piqued the good woman. If I had betrayed any interest, she would probably have closed up like an oyster. As it was, she positively bridled. I should say you did, miss. It's been in all the newspapers. The daily budget's out still to catch the man who did it. It seems, according to them, as our police are no good at all. Well, I hope they'll get him, although a nice looking young fellow he was and no mistake. A kind of soldierly look about him. Well, I dare say he'd been wounded in the war, and sometimes they go a bit queer afterwards, my sister's boy did. Perhaps she'd used him bad, they're a bad lot, those foreigners. Though she was a fine looking woman. Stood there where you're standing now. Was she dark or fair? I ventured. You can't tell from these newspaper portraits. Dark hair and a very white face, too white for nature, I thought, and her lips reddened something cruel. I don't like to see it, a little powder now and then is quite another thing. We were conversing like old friends now. I put another question. Did she seem nervous or upset at all? Not a bit. She was smiling to herself, quite like as though she was amused at something. That's why you could have knocked me down with a feather when, the next afternoon, those people came running out calling for the police and saying there would be murder done. I shall never get over it, and as for setting foot in that house after dark, I wouldn't do it, not if it was ever so. Why, I wouldn't even stay here at the lodge if Sir Eustace hadn't been down on his bended knees to me. I thought Sir Eustace Pedler was at Cannes. So he was, miss. He come back to England when he heard the news, and, as to the bended knees, that was a figure of speech, his secretary, Mr. Paget, having offered us double pay to stay on, and, as my John says, money is money nowadays. I concurred heartily with John's by no means original remarks. The young man now, said Mrs. James, reverting suddenly to a former point in the conversation. He was upset. His eyes, light eyes, they were, I noticed them particular, was all shining. Excited, I thought. But I never dreamt of anything being wrong. Not even when he came out again looking all queer. How long was he in the house? Oh, not long, a matter of 5 minutes maybe. How tall was he, do you think? About 6 foot. I should say so maybe. He was clean-shaven, you say? Yes, miss, not even one of these toothbrush mustaches. Was his chin at all shiny? I asked on a sudden impulse. Mrs. James stared at me with awe. Well, now you come to mention it, miss, it was. However did you know? It's a curious thing, but murderers often have shiny chins, I explained wildly. Mrs. James accepted the statement in all good faith. Really, now, miss? I never heard that before. You didn't notice what kind of a head he had, I suppose? Just the ordinary kind, miss. I'll fetch you the keys, shall I? I accepted them and went on my way to the mill house. My reconstructions so far I considered good. All along I had realized that the differences between the man Mrs. James had described and my tube doctor were those of non-essentials. An overcoat, a beard, gold rimmed eyeglasses. The doctor had appeared middle aged, but I remembered that he had stooped over the body like a comparatively young man. There had been a suppleness which told of young joints. The victim of the accident, the mothball man, as I called him to myself, and the foreign woman, Mrs. de Castina, or whatever her real name was, had had an assignation to meet at the mill house. That was how I pieced the thing together. Either because they feared they were being watched or for some other reason, they chose the rather ingenious method of both getting an order to view the same house. Thus, their meeting there might have the appearance of pure chance. That the mothball man had suddenly caught sight of the doctor, and that the meeting was totally unexpected and alarming to him, was another fact of which I was fairly sure. What had happened next? The doctor had removed his disguise and followed the woman to Marlow. But it was possible that had he removed it rather hastily, traces of spirit gum might still linger on his chin. Hence my question to Mrs. James. Whilst occupied with my thoughts, I had arrived at the low old-fashioned door of the mill house. Unlocking it with the key, I passed inside. The hall was low and dark, the place smelt forlorn and mildewy. In spite of myself, I shivered. Did the woman who had come here, smiling to herself, a few days ago feel no chill of premonition as she entered this house? I wondered. Did the smile fade from her lips, and did a nameless dread close round her heart? Or had she gone upstairs, smiling still, unconscious of the doom that was so soon to overtake her? My heart beat a little faster. Was the house really empty? Was doom waiting for me in it also? For the first time, I understood the meaning of the much used word, atmosphere. There was an atmosphere in this house, an atmosphere of cruelty, of malice, of evil.